In this particular series, we're focused on going deeper into intellectual virtues, and specifically focusing on one intellectual virtue, intellectual autonomy. So Gerald, would you like to begin by just giving us let's say an introduction to the concept of intellectual autonomy? How would you?
Yeah, it's I'd say it's thinking for yourself and acting for yourself, or acting in accord with your best thinking. And in practice, that means not being overly influenced by the thinking of others. It means trying to figure things out to the best of my ability and then acting in accord with that, rather than acting in accord with strictures that are imposed from outside, especially unconscious ones or subterranean ones or interpersonal ones. There's a great variety of those. So to me, it means taking charge of my own actions by using my best thinking to figure out what's the right thing to do, by figuring out what's accurate, what's clear, what's precise, and acting accordingly. So that would be my really concise précis of what intellectual autonomy is at heart.
And where would intellectual standards come in here?
Well, I just happened to mention them. Yeah. So if I'm going to be regulating my behavior, say, or adapting my behavior, it's to my best thinking. And what it means to say my best thinking is it's thinking that's in accord with the intellectual standards. And that is when I want my thinking to be as accurate as it can be under the circumstances, very plausible anyhow, and to be acting in a way that fits the circumstances, that is relevance, and to be as clear as possible about what my goals are, what the impediments are, what the influence of other people is, to have a good picture of that in my mind. And to mention one of the other standards that's particularly appropriate is to go into my motivations as deeply as I can. So depth is one that comes in, because there's a great deal of complexity that comes in how my actions fit with the actions of other people in say my family versus in my job. Those might be very different, versus in my teaching, versus in various domains of my life. So standards are intrinsic to intellectual autonomy. So it doesn't just mean doing what seems okay to me, or being on my own. It doesn't just mean that. It means intellectual autonomy. It means it's in accord with standards of good thinking.
Right. So this is why, one of the reasons why it's so important when we do speak of intellectual virtues to use the term intellectual in front of the other term that we're focused on. And often people want to drop that because it's a shortcut and it's intuitive to want to drop that, but it's not a good idea, because autonomy is not the same thing as intellectual autonomy, though there will be overlap. Right. And it's true for any other of the intellectual virtues. So when we have the intellectual component there, we are there bringing in intellectual standards. And so it's a sort of a reminder move that if you have the intellectual there, then you know you're going to have to be adhering to intellectual standards within that virtue.
Yeah, and I would say that it occurs to me that it may be that intellectual autonomy has its roots developmentally in a more generalized kind of autonomy. So I have a 3-year-old granddaughter, as you know, and she is exercising what might be called autonomy, independence. That she'll say no about a great number of things. She'll throw something across the room to see the reaction. And that's autonomy. And developmentally, I'd say that's extremely important to go through. It's not intellectual autonomy. Intellectual autonomy comes in later, when you start regulating it according to what's relevant or clear or accurate or deep.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So here we're trying to distinguish between someone who is saying at any age, it's, I'm thinking for myself. Okay. I want to be autonomous. So leave me alone. So I'm going to go my own way. That may be entirely irrational. And you gave the example of a 3-year-old really showing the ego, an example of the ego saying, hey, I'm the center of the universe, and I know everything, and I, I have all the truths within me. So autonomy, the standing alone, is itself not, it's neutral, so to speak. It depends on how you're standing alone, on what principles, on what ideas, what ideas are guiding you as you stand alone. And so that the intellectual autonomy means we're standing alone while basically something like this, certifying in our own minds that we are adhering to intellectual standards in good faith.
Right. Yeah. And I'd say, yeah, you mentioned at any age, and that seems important to me because I'm struck now by how many movies there are which portray a character as autonomous, as defiant of all authority, and how they're granted praise by the movie maker simply in virtue of being opposed to all authority. And I myself have some kind of romantic seeming inclination toward esteeming those people, but it's completely, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, would you want someone who is like that as your friend, as your brother, as your parent, someone who's just interested in being on her own or his own?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes that character is mixed with a little actual intellectual autonomy. So that makes it even more confusing. So, and so what we have is, as it were, an anemic view of intellectual autonomy insofar as we have it in mainstream life at all, so to speak, because it's not, as with all the intellectual virtues, it's not part of the conversation. It's dealt with somewhat superficially. Sometimes there's depth, of course, but we're talking about on average here. So this muddies the water, this point that you're making, these examples that are out there that people, where people are looking for guidance, the models that they're seeing are often weak